Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March 2019 meeting of the local New York ARSC chapter. Tonight we have a very special program. This is a real techie program, which I love. This is going to be a conversation with Bob Shuster and Marco Sueiro, interviewing him concerning a topic that's very important in this day and age, concerning the fact we're all gone digital. It's called Maintaining Vintage Analog Audio Equipment in a Digital Age. Let me just read something a little short about both Bob and Marcos. Concerning Bob Shuster, at around the age of 10, Bob was fascinated with mechanical things, particularly reel-to-reel tape decks, and he began taking them apart and putting them back together astonishingly well. Over the years, this developed into Bob's ultimate love and amazingly deep knowledge of all reel-to-reel machines, both professional and consumer models. He has assisted AES, the Audio Engineering Society, with their Audio History Museum project to recover and document lost materials and information relating to the history of the reel-to-reel machine. He attended both the Eastman School of Music and IAR, the Institute of Audio Research, for audio engineering and technical maintenance engineering. When he graduated from them in 1977, Bob began his long career in the upper echelon of world-class recording studios. At Media Sound in Manhattan, he was dubbed Midnight Bob, as we all know him fondly, and isn't that your email address too?
Yeah, Bob 12 a.m.
Bob's, same difference.
Yeah, same thing.
Due to the fact that he performed all of the heavy technical maintenance and repair work on the studio equipment during the midnight to 8 a.m. shift. 10 more years were spent at what is considered by many to be the most technically acclaimed studio thus far in the history of recording, Power Station Studios, as a senior audio maintenance engineer. Bob was also affiliated with Record Plant, Electric Lady, Sony Studios as a mastering technical maintenance engineer. Was it Poman or Poman? P-O-M?
Poman Sound.
Okay, Poman Sound. As a video post-production technical maintenance engineer, Avatar Studios, the former Power Station Studio, opened under new ownership, along with the NBC and MTV Viacom networks as an on-air systems engineer for both companies. During that time, Shuster, sorry, I'm thinking of a cellist. Shuster Sound was Bob's sideline business. Now it focuses on professional and consumer audio technical maintenance, repair, and installation. Marco Sueiro, Sueiro, I'll get it right. I'm sorry, names always throw me. Sueiro is the archives manager at New York Public Radio. He is also co-chair of ARSC Technical Committee and was part of the collection management task force that drafted the Library of Congress National Recording Preservation Plan in 2012. In 2011, he co-translated the definitive text on audio preservation, guidelines for the production and preservation of digital audio objects. He is a member of the Standards Committee of the AES and Director of Education Committee of the Archivists Roundtable of Metropolitan New York. Without further ado, I want to introduce Bob and Marcos. And gentlemen, you have the forum. Enjoy.
Thanks, Seth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Seth.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming on this rather unpleasant evening in New York City. Bob, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with what may be the most important question of the night. How is my Tandberg cassette deck doing?
Lots of problems with it.
I was afraid you were going to say that. Bob, you're a bit of a legend, as you know, and what I'd like to do is start talking a little bit about, well, we heard a little bit about how you got started, but what do you think was your big break? How did that happen for you to start in the industry?
My big break was, believe it or not, one of my friends from high school dropped out of college to become a songwriter. And he was coming to my home studio to cut demos. And he was sending these demos to record companies. And they invited me to come down to hear these, saying, how did you get the sound on these demos? And the songwriter was Gary Portnoy, who later wound up doing the theme and singing the theme from the TV show Cheers. And he had done an album for Capitol Records in '77, and the engineer and the producer wanted me to come in and sit on the sessions, and this was back at Record Plant, summer of Star Wars. And they wanted to know how I got these sounds on on tape. The quality. You're using TIAC and Sony mixers, and I wasn't even using Neumann or AKG microphones. I was using Shure's and Akai, and that was it. And they had a couple of Sony mics, and they said amazing. So some of the sessions wound up over at Media Sound, and the engineer was Mike DeLug, who at that time was big doing the Barry Manilow records, and his father was Milton DeLug, who's famous for the old Omnibus series. But anyway, it came down to one day, there was no assistant engineer on the session. Everybody's sitting around doing nothing, and I come walking in, and I say, why are you guys sitting around? They didn't give us an assistant engineer. So we're sitting there, and all of a sudden, everybody starts looking at me. I said, oh, Bob, you could do that, couldn't you? And I said, can you thread that MCI tape machine? I said, sure. And I said, I got up, threaded, and before I knew it, I was assisting on the session. So that was a big break right there. So after a couple hours, Mike says, Bob, you want to work here? This was around the time when Media Sound was splitting with the Power Station. The people involved with Power Station were originally from Media Sound, but mostly Tony Bon Jovi and Bob Walters. And they were taking engineers from Media Sound, people like Bob Clearmountain, of all people. And they were losing some staff, so it was that right time of to grab it. And they said, Bob, we'll have you interview with the studio manager, and the studio manager at the time was Susan Planer, rest in peace. And she said, Bob, why would you want to work in a studio here in Manhattan? I said, Susan, I'd patch the cracks in the men's room wall to work in a place like this. She said, okay, 9 o'clock, shipping department, Monday morning. That was it. So, and that's how I got started, but I was starting out as a recording engineer, not a technical engineer. And back in the day, studios like Media Sound or Record Plant or Electric Lady, you started out in the shipping department, and either you were a gopher or a shipper or a PA. Media Sound called them shippers. What you were really doing, it was schlepping everything.
Getting coffee.
Right, getting coffee, making deliveries. I remember the first day making a gazillion trips on the subway and buses going to record companies and post houses and advertising agencies, dropping off tapes. Because back then, the messenger service was in-house. It was a service of the studio. You didn't have a messenger service like today. So we went out and did all this stuff. So after about 3 weeks of that stuff, the chief engineer up in the technical department, back then big studios had technical departments that took care of the equipment because we had alignments to do it for every session. Studios ran 24/7, and if something broke down at 3 in the morning, you can't call back then Martin Audio or somebody else saying, I need this fixed now. We got a session going, and I believe back in '77, the hourly rate at Media Sound was about 150, 160, which was pretty high. Studios today can't even get that.
Yeah.
But that's what it was back then. It was union musicians and the old time engineering, and that's the way it ran. So, professionally. Consoles were bought by record companies and recording studios, and not somebody that would buy it for their house. But anyway, one thing led to another. The chief engineer of the tech department found out that I could repair machinery, and he said, "What the hell is this kid doing down in the shipping department when I can use him up in the shop?" Because back then, one way to get into the recording end of it was to work in the tech shop, and then you could move on to become a setup person or assistant engineer and work your way up to engineering. That was the way things used to work in a big New York studio. You started down at the bottom, and at Media Sound, you could either be the receptionist or the cleaning guy or the shipping guy or in the tech department. So the tech engineer back at the time, Fred Porter, who's still around, believe it or not, said, "Bob, come work in the tech shop and give you more money, and we'll teach you everything." And back then, studios taught you a lot of the ins and outs of working in a recording studio. There was, basically even how to wind the mic cables, how to thread the tape, how to fill out take sheets. They didn't teach you that in a school. You know,
But
they
you
try
had-
to.
But you had a background already. Right?
Yes, I had a background already. I built a home studio when I was 18. I built a 4-channel, 4-track studio using the famous TIAC 3340S. I had a Sony mixer, the MX20, which was their quote semi-pro mixer. It was 8 in, 4 out, but at least it had balanced ins and out with transformers. That had a simple EQ. No Phantom. I had to add the Phantom to it, but. And I had a second tape machine, another 1/4-track machine, just stereo, so that I could make a stereo mix from the 4-track, take that stereo mix and put it on the 4-channel machine. You could add 2 more channels and then make another mix. It was bouncing tapes back and forth to do multi-track productions. I also was a big user of the outboard Dolby B boxes that were available back then, like the TIAC AN300, the AM180, the AM160, was it the AN80? And even though it was Dolby being very basic, it did help cut down some of the noise when I was going like 8 generations down from the original master.
Did you start with the bass? That's what we used.
What we did was the first 4 channels would be drums, stereo piano, and bass. This is the way Gary Portnoy did his demos.
Huh.
And then we would make a basic stereo mix of that onto another 2-track tape, 1/4-track, put that back on the TIAC 4-channel, and add 2 more tracks, and it would be like rhythm guitar and like a lead guitar, and then we'd mix that down again, put that tape. We'd had 2 masters. We had a master 1 and a master 2, and I kept cycling them back and forth. And we'd wind up, using maybe anywhere from 16 to 24, sometimes 30 tracks, just bouncing back and forth. And those original tracks, like the drums and the bass, and the piano could be 8 generations away, so you had to do some tricky EQing. I had a outboard graphic EQ, BSR, believe it or not, FEW3, if I recall. And I had sort of did an inverse of what you lost every time you made a copy. It would turn it around and sort of bring it back to almost its original quality. You could never get original, but it worked. We kept that formula going, and we got some great sounding demos. To this day, people listen to them and they say, "How did you get that sound?"
So that was your secret, the pre-emphasis.
Yeah, it was probably pre-emphasis, multiple generations, and a lot of thinking ahead. You had to think ahead, just like Les Paul said, because once he made a tape, and his early tapes, every time he went over and added a new part, it would erase his previous part. But he had to mix it together as it was doing live, so it's crazy.
Yep.
And that's when we had, cell sync, and, he came up with that whole idea. But we were doing the same thing. Beatles were doing the same thing. They were doing 4 tracks, 2 4-track machines bouncing back and forth. But they had one advantage. They were 1-inch 4-channel, and they could get the signal to noise ratio and the dynamic range. But hey, we had to do it with the home gear.
Well, obviously it worked, but you were doing
It worked.
So.
So I was doing, even though I had, my chops was doing it in the home studio, even though I had gone to the Eastman School of Music and IAR. The only thing I learned at IAR, because I had gone to Eastman, was their course that Al Grundy was giving at the time, was practical disc recording. I had to know how to use a disc cutter, because I was working with Neumann lathes and Scully lathes at Media Sound. And later, believe it or not, Sony Music Studios had one of the old CBS disc computer modified Scully machines. So,
That was on the first floor.
yeah, that was on the first floor, yeah. So, but the Eastman School of Music had it was for 2 years a summer recording course that had people like Don Palouse from CBS Records and Hugh Davies from Capitol Records. The year before the year that I went, what's his face? Gotta think a little bit here. Phil Ramone was one of the instructors too.
Wow.
Yeah. We had acoustic engineers. We also had several design engineers, and they would basically teach us all their stuff. To this day, I still have an EQ chart that Hugh Davies gave us on his favorite things to EQ and what frequencies for every instrument.
Does that program still exist?
I don't know. Well, that was Ross Ritchie, who was the chief of the recording department at Eastman School of Music. They had quite a setup in 1974. They were 1-inch 8-track back then for university level facility that was pretty.
Was maintenance covered at all in this program?
They had a guy that was doing maintenance. I forgot his name.
But, I mean, but was it taught? Would you take apart?
No, there was no maintenance. There was one guy there, Neil Muncie, if that name rings a bell, who was his company was Suburban Sound. He had made recording consoles. He was also big on tape machine design, and I learned a lot about tape machine operation through him. He was the one that taught us like how to align a tape machine, and we spent a whole day with an Ampex 440 B, if I recall, because that's they had the 74, and we went through the whole manual as a class on how to set it up. He had the scope, and he had his meters, and he had a gadget that he invented called the 30-day Wonder Box. And it was a whole interesting patch panel that will allow you to monitor the tape and also see it on the scope at the same time. And I think I even have the plans for that sitting around somewhere too. But he was a good mentor as far as tape machine design and how tape machines operate, the basics of tape machine, everything from repro electronics, record electronics, the bias oscillator and stuff. And then we had, when I went to Media Sound, the tech department there, they taught you everything. Wiring, the proper way to wiring, looming consoles and, working with punch blocks and making the proper way to make mic cables, making direct boxes. Back then, a lot of these little things you couldn't go and buy in a store. You had to make them. We made our own direct boxes. There was a direct box out there, the Countryman Direct, but we weren't going to spend $150 or whatever it was to make a direct box, to get a direct box from them. We wound up getting, Jensen transformers or Freed transformers. Sometimes we pulled transformers out of old equipment and salvaged them for something else. And yeah,
that makes sense.
But
so, Eastman School of Music, did you have an instrument?
Believe it or not, I used to play bassoon.
Okay.
I don't play it anymore, but
Do you still have it?
No, I don't. I have to borrow one if called to, but I haven't played it in years.
And how do you get more into? So, as a maintenance engineer, you service all kinds of equipment.
Yes, the maintenance engineer back in the day basically serviced all the electronics that were used in the studio, the console, tape machines, of course, were the most important. Right after that, the Dolby units were very important. Dolby was a big deal back in the 70s. Sure. Dolby A, and then all the equipment associated in a recording studio, like outboard equalizers, which would be like Pultecs, which were the most common ones. There was some Langs. Then we had Neves, outboard Neve. Then we had compressor limiters, the Uris and DBX, and then we had a little extra stuff. We had Keypexes, the noise gates.
Oh, Keypex.
Yeah, the old Keypexes with the neon lights that would blink up and down. I have to remember, this was like around 1977.
Did you become more specialized into tape machines at some point?
Well, I was always big on tape machines, but I also fixed the other gear because it was very similar and it was stuff that we had to work on. But when there was a tape machine problem, I was called on to take care of that. And even though we had Ampex and 3M and MCI, sometimes we ran into problems that even the manufacturer couldn't figure out. Ampex was pretty good on that, but sometimes we ran into some problems with the 3Ms and the MCIs, and we had to figure it out ourselves. And we'd be spending like those countless hours in the wee hours of the morning, Midnight Bob, and the chief engineer and I would be sitting there trying to figure out why this wasn't working. And sometimes it wasn't even had to do anything with the audio. One of the biggest problems we had was with the old 3M M79s was their
sorry about the bad sound.
Was their autolocator, which they didn't call an autolocator, it was known as select take. We affectionately called it search and destroy. So, and that was one of the problems why it was not doing what it was supposed to be doing. And 3M really couldn't help us on that. And it was funny because one of the big guys at 3M was also at Ampex, was Dale Manquin. So he wasn't really involved with the select take thing. That was a bunch of other engineers. He was involved with the whole ISO loop design of the 3M machine.
So the 70s was the beginning of the basically integrated circuit, right? So you were moving.
ICs were even back in the 60s.
But I mean, when it really started taking.
Yeah, it was really taking off. The op amp. There was discrete op amps like the infamous API 2520. Then there was the 741 chip, which was the very first real op amp that was the biggie. slow as hell, but still sounded good. Even to this day, some of those old 741s work very well. Then it became the 5532s, 5534s, which even to this day are still being used. It's a.
How did that change for you? How did that make things easier or more difficult?
Well, it made things easier because it wasn't so many components that were doing each little thing. It was just on a chip.
Right.
But it was still same kind of troubleshooting. The fact that it wasn't. It was still through-hole components on a circuit board, so it was still easy to service. Today you have stuff that's now what they call surface mount devices, SMD, and very miniaturized, and a lot of it cannot be repaired. I mean, it's just too small to see. And even if you do have a delicate iron that can handle that stuff, if you don't watch what you're doing, you wind up losing half the parts off the board. It's so small.
Yeah.
Most of the gear, luckily, that I work on is still a lot of the vintage gear, which is still being used. I would say one thing about the 70s was the major turning point for a lot of the technology we are using in studios today. A lot of things happened in the 70s. Modular consoles. The multi-track tape recorder became more ergonomically useful in the studio than the earlier machines. They could bring the remote right up to the console rather than having an assistant engineer sit there and turn controls, getting calls across the room. Hey, left channel, blah, channel 23 sync, or like one time I went to RCA Studios to sit in on a session, and there was like 6 people in the room that were just the union guys. One guy was there to announce roll tape. One guy there was to do the patches. One guy there was to thread the tape, and one guy making the coffee. So
Wow, that was unique.
that was, I said, what's going on here? Coming from a studio like Media Sound, the independent studios, you were lucky, if it was just 2 people in the room. Sometimes you had a setup person, but that was about it.
Yeah. Now, you say in your website that Power Station was, in your opinion, the best recording studio possibly ever in the history of recording. What makes you say that?
There's some kind of, I can't say like, maybe I should say there was some magic in the place. It's just that it was the right building, the right people designing at the time, the right people, it just happened to be the right people at the time making the place, and everything worked. The rooms sound great, and it still does, and the testament is it's one of the last studios left in Midtown Manhattan. Now it's owned by Berkeley School of Music, Boston, but now it's Berkeley, New York City. They just recently shut it down after operating it for a year. They're going to be doing a lot of renovation, and I'm crossing my fingers that they're not going to ruin the rooms, because the whole secret was what Tony Bon Jovi basically said, that you build a giant room within another giant room. Because you go into Studio A, if you've ever been at Power Station or Avatar, behind those walls is a huge space. And that's what got the great sound in A. And to a smaller extent, Studio B shared part of that space. But Tony's whole thing was that you should be able to build a studio from your local home improvement store. You should be able to get all the wood and fiberglass, and you go in there, and everything was all this pine. And how he put it together was, what the secret was, that it wasn't dimensional lumber. You look at it and say, oh, those look like 1x2s and 1x3s and 1x4s. No, you would sit there. He said, go take a ruler and measure each strip of wood. Each one was cut differently from cut lengthwise.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, everything and everything. But the whole basic thing was, it was a lot of burlap and a lot of fiberglass. Nothing fancy, just stuff that you would normally get. But he put it together. He had a lot of people helping him with it. Ed Evans was the technical engineer who did a lot of the wiring design and even a lot of the room designs. And it turned out to be a very, very successful design. The building getting the building was a miracle. It was originally a Con Ed AC/DC converter.
Oh, wow.
For the old 9th Avenue elevated subway that's long gone. So it was a perfect place for a studio. Some of the floors were 4 feet thick concrete. so that you had very good isolation for the other floors. We had 2 floors of studios, and in between those 2 floors was office space, where people also had small songwriting rooms and little, rehearsal areas and stuff.
So back then, what was your recurrent nightmare in terms of maintenance? What drove you nuts?
Let's see, it was a number of things, but the biggest thing was the tape machines. That's probably why I became so big with tape machines. There were inherent problems in all the models, and you have to remember we were running studios 24/7,
Right.
and these machines were getting used almost 24 hours a day, and they required a lot of maintenance, and even though a lot of them were very well engineered, you did find flaws because of all this long operating time. Particularly, I go back to the 3M machine, the M79 with the ISO loop. It was very critical with the tape path because of the way the 2 pinch rollers would hit the tape at different sections. And if it wasn't precisely aligned, you would get wrinkles in the tape, and you'd see your 2-inch tape come flying off the heads. So it would be like when I was at Media Sound, we had 2 3M machines. It was like one night, the machine in Studio A needs work. Got it all working. Then the next night it'd be the machine in Studio B. So it was back and forth. So tape machines required a lot of maintenance. After that, it was the consoles. The consoles, which got the most physical contact of any piece of gear in the room. The biggest nightmare was people spilling things into the board, which was the number one. Luckily, it was the faders that got hit the most. And it was easy, you could take the faders apart, especially if you had the good P&Gs. But still, it put considerable wear and tear on it. But there was occasional people, somebody puts a drink on the meter bridge and it would spill into the board, that kind of stuff. Yep. So the board was the next thing. After that, you had people using the big starboard booms in the big rooms like Studio A, and they put like a nice, tube 47 mic, almost 30 feet in the air with these booms, and forgot to properly put the band on it. In the middle of a session, we hear a crash, and it's there, that wonderful microphone squished. Yeah, so we never trusted the famous Atlas LO2B locking adapter, which went on the end of the microphone. It would just snap lock, so you didn't have to screw it on there. We actually had you'd have to tie it to the mic stand, so in case the adapter broke, the mic would just hang there off the end of the boom.
Sure.
Other than that, everything else, we had the usual wear and tear of gear, people spilling ketchup on the outboard gear. When even though we had rooms and lounge areas for people to eat, people had to eat while they were doing a session. I don't know why. Same reason why you had to record at 3 a.m. was beyond belief too. So.
How about smoke? Was smoke a problem?
Oh yeah, that was another thing. Hard to believe in this day and age, but I used to walk into control rooms. You couldn't see people. You saw rays of light coming down from the track lighting of smoke. It was all over the place. It was when you would take a piece of gear and bring it back to the shop, that Pultex silver front was more gold looking than anything else. And the stench when you came home, you just, it was awful. I mean,
it's amazing that they worked in that.
It was amazing they worked in that environment.
What consoles were you using?
All right, when I came there in '77, we had a mix. You have to remember the mid-'70s was the big change from what I call the old aluminum plate monsters of the custom consoles that engineers used to build for the studio. Basically, they took a big sheet of aluminum and drilled all the holes for the pan pots and the level controls and equalizers and trim pots, and they'd be all brought out to amplifier cards and racks. You'd be using like old GE or RCA, or if anybody remembers the old Spectrasonic 101 cards, there was API cards. So when I came there in '77, they were just getting rid of their last home-built Spectrasonic board in Studio A, and they were putting in a nice brand new Neve 8068 custom built. And Media bought 2, both for both Studio A and Studio B. And they had custom design. They had stereo sends where the original Neve 8068 had 8 mono sends. So, and we had a whole echo return panel that the stock Neves didn't have. We had some very, very, very well very well-bred engineers over there, one of them being Fred Christie from the old NBC days. You know, back then a lot of these engineers actually had a degree in engineering and they knew something about design, about putting things together. So he and Fred Porter were designing things and saying, Neve, you got to do this and do that. So, but before that, the other board that media had up was the lounge studio up on the second floor was an API console. It was a 32-in, 8-out board using the 2520s. And what was nice about that board, and especially with API, was that there were 2 jacks on the patch bay, ACA, active combining amplifier. You took 2 patch cords, went into that, and came out of the monitor out section, and the board suddenly became a 64-input console because you could use the monitor section and the main recording section for mixing. Because the monitor section was only being used when you were tracking. Otherwise, it was sitting there doing nothing. This is this is when you suddenly started having inline consoles. So you had like an SSL 4000, you would have a 48 input console that could also be used for recording and mixing all in one. That was inline. But the monitor section, API found a way of using that thing where it just sat there doing nothing during a mix, where it suddenly became an active mixer.
Yeah. And speaking of SSLs, and that was also the beginning of kind of computerized, when computers kind of started getting their foot in the door.
When I was at Media Sound, we still had automation on the API console. We had the Allison 65K. And if anybody remembers that, before the Allison 65K, Allison had a thing called, by the way, Allison, the same Allison that made the Keypex and also the Gain Brain, which was their other thing, which was an expander. But Allison made their first automation system was Memory's Little Helper. And it was a giant rack with a bunch of blinking lights. It looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. The very first Synergy album, Larry Fast, the synth player, his very first record used the API console with the Memory's Little Helper, and it was back then that room was set up as a quad room. You could actually mix a quadraphonic record in that room. And he went to, back then we used to master half-inch 4-track to get the 4-channel sound, but it was a very early based automation system that used time code off a track with the tape machine, but it was very short-lived because Allison had quickly decided that it wasn't the thing to go with, and they came out with the 65K, and the 65K was a SMPTE-based automation system, but it required using 2 tracks of your multi-track, so you only had 22 tracks, because when you updated, you had to carry the SMPTE information over to another track with your updates.
Yeah, yep.
And you had to watch out, because if you went more than 20 updates, it would shift the mix because of the delay. So we were using... yeah.
Oh my God.
So you still had to do a lot of thinking. It gave you basic mutes and basic level change, and that was about it. It couldn't do any snapshots of console settings like SSL. SSL basically came out with the first truly workable automation system.
Did that change your life? Like, was it?
Well, I wasn't introduced.
At first, they weren't too reliable, right?
Right. Well, SSL went through several learning processes. They had the right idea with their computer. Their computer was an industrial production computer that was used for automation in factories, like for canning food and stuff. That was the computer. We didn't have the computers back then like we have today.
Sure.
So they adapted a production line computer to control faders. The later versions, they were able to do instant recall. That would give you the pictures of the controls, and you would just turn the controls by looking at the picture, and you would see where you would line up the control where it said in the picture, and the thing would change from black to white, and saying that's exactly where that pan pot was, or that high frequency EQ control was.
Sure.
And and back then we were using floppy disks. First the 8-inch, then we went to the little 5.5 inch, and then the 3.5, and then we also had the Bernoulli disks, which were the enclosed drives.
Yep.
Yeah, and you hear them clanking away in the back of the room, so it was quite a thing, but it had to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Neve came out with their flying fader system. The NECAM, first it was NECAM, then flying faders. Dale Manquin was the guy behind the flying fader system. And the flying faders worked very well. It was the same thing. It also gave you pictures, snapshot pictures of the board. By the way, the very first, actually, and this is where the term snapshot came from, the very first way of getting a recall of a board was the assistant engineer actually took a Polaroid camera and took pictures of the board of all the settings. Because, a room like at Media Sound, like Studio A, there were 3 to 4, sometimes 5 sessions a day in that room. It wasn't lockouts. We didn't believe in lockouts. So everybody had to memorize and take notes. A lot of yellow steno paper there, writing where this patch was and that patch was. Because, these rooms couldn't sit idle. There was jingle dates in the morning from like 8 to 12. Then there was some afternoon jingle work. There was some, at Media Sound, we did a lot of stuff for the Children's Television Workshop. We were doing a lot of stuff for Sesame Street. We were doing all the music for them, including all the Muppet stuff. Jim Henson and Frank Oz would come in and do all their lines and stuff. And then, in the late afternoon, you'd start getting, the music acts would be in. And they would come in like, 3 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And then we had the overnight groups coming in,
The indies.
Yeah, the indies and even record company work. They would come whatever the time when the room was available, and if they couldn't get studios A and B, they would do overdubs in Studio C. We also had several smaller rooms. We actually had edit rooms, so that you didn't have to tie up a studio if you were putting an album together, like what they called leadering and tailing the masters. You had an edit room. It was basically a room full of 2 tracks, and you could sit there and put your whole master together.
Yep.
And then we also had disc cutting rooms, so we could make reference acetates. Or we did, Media did mastering too, but it was on a limited basis. Back then, it's hard to believe that back in the 70s, the only way you could present a demo to a record company was either an acetate, from a cutter, like a 10-inch acetate, or a reel-to-reel tape. Cassettes were not considered good enough to submit to record companies.
They weren't.
It wasn't until the Sony Walkman that changed everything. All of a sudden, music producer can now hear a bunch of cassettes by just clamping on a pair of headphones and listening to them. So now it became imperative that record company offices had to have a cassette deck now.
Yeah.
And that basically ended the acetate era. Also, a lot of advertising agencies wanted a record because everybody had a phonograph in their office.
Right.
But that quickly changed too. Cassettes took over by 79, 80. But we still hung on to one disc cutting room because we still had clients that wanted to master on our lathe. We had a old VMS system there. It was working very well.
And did you service that too?
No, believe it or not, if there was problems, the mastering engineer at the time took care of it. We had one guy that took care of it, though. Fred Porter would occasionally take care of it. But the mastering engineer there was Ray Janos, who later became Sterling Sound's #1 disc cutting engineer. I believe he's not there anymore because now Sterling does all of their mastering in Nashville now. Since Sterling moved, to Jersey. So.
Yeah. All right. This is an ARSC meeting, so I feel like we should talk a little bit about.
You got enough of my
collection
history.
of
I can talk more hours.
No, this is all fascinating.
Yeah.
But let's talk about tape a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. Created before World War II, it's been almost, or actually has been 80 years.
Well,
it's
let's
been
say-
around. What do you attribute to tape for being so successful?
All right, well, let's do a small little history before we hit the tape thing. There was magnetic recording in the late 1800s,
Sure.
about 1880, 1890s. That was, Vladimir Paulsen, the Danish engineer who came up with the theory of magnetic recording, but they didn't have the technology.
10 years before.
10 years before?
But he-
I know, I'm not going to get into the French guy right now. It gets too complicated.
New Jersey guy.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
Talking about Oberlin Smith.
Yes.
yeah, but Paulson had patents on it, so
And he produced the machine.
right, he produced a machine that, the early forms of the telegraphon and stuff, but the earliest forms of magnetic recording was on wire.
Sure.
So we had wire recording, which actually in later years the wire recordings didn't sound that bad. It went at a very high speed, but they sounded pretty good. But there were limitations. You couldn't splice it. If you tried to, you had to make a knot, and you'd hear it go by and sometimes catch on the head that was trying to do. And then it had a terrible tendency to unravel all over the place and be impossible to deal with. Seth could tell you that too. So I still, once in a while I deal with wire. But it wasn't until the late 20s, early 30s that the Germans, of all people, were tinkering with tape, taking a plastic base and putting magnetic oxide on tape. And you had companies that were very, that were doing this stuff with other types of materials, particularly BASF. They were coating plastic materials with all kinds of inks and dyes, and
Right.
and
That's why it's called pigment.
right, pigment. So they came up with an idea saying, hey, why don't we take an iron oxide mud, with a binder, and coat it on strips of plastic tape and have it run across a magnetic head. And that was the original magnetophone. And while it wasn't really known too well in the U.S. about this, there was curiosity, particularly during World War II, saying, how the hell was symphony orchestras playing at 3 a.m. in the morning, or Hitler giving speeches at 4 in the morning, and they would listen to it and say, this is not coming off a transcription. Transcription is a record that was done on a disc recorder.
It was
Sure.
Jack Mullen.
Right,
He was
Jack.
sharing his broadcast
Right,
at Portnoy.
right. He was with the Signal Corps, and when we won the war, one of the things that this guy, Jack Mullen, was able to do was secure any technology that could be used for the rest of the world. And one of the things he went to Radio Frankfurt, and asked one of the guys, what was used to play this music in the morning that wasn't on records or speeches? And the guy said, oh, it was this thing right over here. It's this magnetophone. And he had a guy set up a roll of tape, and he played it back. And back then, the speed was approximately at 30 IPS. Right. And it wasn't quarter-inch tape. It was some metric number. It could have been very close to 6.3 millimeter or something. I'm not positive on that size. But anyway, he was astonished at the sound quality. It sounded just like live.
Right.
For all practical purposes. So they said, I want to bring one of these machines back. So he did a very clever thing. Since it was too big, he took it apart and had it shipped through the postal service of the Air Force or whatever military postal service was, and had it shipped back to his mom in like 30 or 40 boxes.
Yep.
And now, he did not bring the electronics back. He brought the schematics back, the original AEG Telefunken schematics, and had somebody in the U.S. out in California build a replica of the electronics because it was just too much to ship, but he needed the tape transport. And he brought back about 40 rolls of tape because he said, nobody's making this stuff anywhere else except in Germany. Well, he got somebody to build the electronics, and when Jack used to have his road show of historic recording, and one year he brought it to AES here in New York, wow. And he had the original magnetophone, but I do have a copy of he was featured on a show on, believe it or not, on WNYC FM. Back then there was a radio show called Men of Hi-Fi with Harry Maynard. Sure. And there was a guy that had a tape, I forgot who it was, of the Bing Crosby show that was on tape. And they played like about 5 minutes of the show, but Jack played the same tape years later at the AES show, but he had the whole show.
Huh.
The story goes is that Bing Crosby wanted to do transcribed
Right,
programs.
yeah.
Right.
I can,
He was
yeah.
on NBC, they wouldn't let him do it. And he comes to Jack one day when he heard about the tape recorders.
Yeah.
And he brings two 16-inch discs, a reference of one of his live broadcasts. And he plays it where he's doing a cigarette commercial. And he coughs, and the audience starts to laugh.
Right.
He says, can you remove the laughter and the cough? So Jack ran the tape, a copy of it, then marked it off, took out the cough and the laughter, spliced it together and played it for him. It was absolutely seamless. Bing Crosby looked at him and he said, well, how much money do you need to start this Ampex company?
Well, Bing Crosby gave about between $40,000 to $50,000 to Ampex.
Right, and then what happened is Crosby broke his contract with NBC and went to CBS because they would allow him to run on tape and transcribe it.
Yeah. Well, what happened was that Jack Mullen presented his tape machine to the, I think it was the Radio Broadcasters Association in California. I'm not positive on that, but he was demonstrating this thing, and they were astonished at the sound quality of this thing. And that's when the people at Bing Crosby Enterprises heard about this thing, and they said, all right, we want to have a shootout between our disc cutters and the tape machines, because Crosby was doing a lot of ad-libbing during his show. That was another reason. And they had to keep piecing the show together. And the only way to piece shows together back then was 2 turntables and slip queuing and having a disc cutter running at the same time. You made one mistake, you had to start all over again, because a disc cutter ran, you can't stop it.
And blanks were expensive.
Right, and blanks were expensive. So they said, all right, you set up your tape machine, and you do the recording at the same time. All right, after the show was over, everybody went to their work. The disc cutting guys made their show, and Jack was there sitting editing his tape. In 30 minutes, Jack had the show all edited, and they said, Jack, what are you doing? I said, I'm finished. He said, you're finished? He said, yeah, here, let's play the tape. So they played the whole show, and the other guys were still working on the discs.
Yeah.
That was the big change. Now, NBC said, we cannot allow tape to go on the air. So they made a transcription. So in the beginning it was NBC, then it moved to CBS. But NBC was way behind. Basically what was happening was they were saying, well, they were saying, how come our guys can't make a machine like this? Now it took forever for RCA to make a tape machine, and their machines really weren't that good. They were terrible. I had the great displeasure of working on one a couple of years ago. A guy actually got it, and I said, my God, nobody liked this thing. Yeah, they were Tinker Toys. One of the biggest jokes, this is getting a little bit off topic here, was that people that worked at a lot of the radio stations, the NBC affiliates, knew how good the Ampexes were. They would get the Ampexes, and then they would, when the big guys, when the coats from NBC would come down, they would put a nameplate RCA over the Ampex name, and they said, "Oh, these are our RCA machines." They didn't know, so it went back to Ampex, But anyway, getting back to the story, Bing Crosby said, "I want these machines as a studio production machine," because it was Jack using his homebrew AEG, magnetophone machine, and there were only 40 rolls of tape. He had to save every little piece of tape. Every outtake had to be reused again. That's when they contacted 3M. This was around also the time when Bing found a company, and Jack found the company Ampex, which was getting out of the World War II post-war industry. They were making they were making motors and gyroscopes and stuff. Motors for gyroscopes, that's what Ampex was making. So Ampex needed a peacetime product, and they said, this is perfect, this is what we want to make. So they came out with the Ampex 200, later became the 200A.
Well, tell them how big the Ampex 200, I saw the one.
Oh, the Ampex 200, well, the Ampex 200,
It's about the size of a coffin.
yeah, it was about the size of a nice big-sized washing machine and dryer.
Right.
Doors on the front like
Yeah,
this.
big wooden doors, black, sort of a little bit Art Deco design with the handles and stuff, and big tubs of electronics inside. One for repro, one for record, one for the bias. Took 14-inch reels, ran 30 IPS. The reel turntables, they didn't have reels back then. They were actually using pancakes with a top flange cover.
Yep.
And the flanges they were using were these mirror-surfaced, high-quality, it was very, very finely machined, because Ampex was an old-school, machinist company. They meticulous, beautiful design, very nice design. But
Talk a little more about 3M.
3M?
3M story is interesting, too.
all right, well, 3M, it came down to the fact that Ampex needed tape.
Right.
And they said, well, we're making this machine, we're looking at the tape that Jack had. 3M was the only company at the time that was working with adhesives, with and plastics, and they were doing things like putting the gold foil or something like gold foil around the cigarette bands.
Huh.
It was very similar to that type of thing of taking a metallic pigment and transferring it to paper. So 3M's very first tape was paper tape, which their successful number was Scotch 100, which was a paper-based brown oxide tape. And it was basically the same idea that they would put like a gold foil on a cigarette, the same type of idea, but they were using they were using an iron oxide with a binder and coating it on plastic tape, and they were slitting it to 1/4 inch. They wanted to stick to the standard US SAE dimensions. This is when they decided tape machines are going to run 30 IPS, tape is going to be 1/4 inch.
Right.
And Jack was the one that got 3M behind making tape for Ampex. So our very first tape was from 3M. And it was 1/4 inch, and it worked great with the 200A. And the very first 200As were going for like $4,000 to $5,000, and this was in 1946, 47. Big time.
Yeah, yeah.
So, only radio stations could afford it, maybe top-notch record companies could use it, and some small studios that could have, that were doing record company work could afford these things. But that was where it all started. About 2 years later, Ampex came out with the 300 and basically cut the price of the machine in half. Technology marches on. And here we go. You had the 300, which also ran at 15 IPS and 30. They were able to cut the speed in half, that you could use smaller reels. The 14-inch reels, you were only getting a half an hour at 30 IPS. So if you had 15 10.5-inch reels, they cut the size in half, and they said 10.5-inch reel could record 30 minutes, which would be great for a radio show. Actually, it recorded 33.15 seconds per side if you went at a true 2,500-foot spool. But for radio, 29 minutes was long enough because of because of commercial inserts and stuff. It worked out fine. Everything was based on what a half-hour radio show was going to be like. So they had the 300. And the big deal with the 300 was that it used an indirect capstan. Most machines, the capstan which pulls the tape at an even speed across the heads, was usually a direct drive motor. Ampex said that they could improve the wound flutter spec by going with the 300 with an indirect capstan. In other words, the motor was driving a flywheel that had a rubber rim, and that way it helped reduce transmitting motor noise through the rubber. The rubber actually isolated the motor noise, and you could also improve the flutter spec because the capstan could now run at a slightly different speed rather than what was dictated by the capstan motor. The capstan motor could run at a higher speed. You made a bigger diameter flywheel, the capstan would run slower, and it worked. The only problems we had was that the rubber would dry out and it would cause problems. It would cause slippage and it would cause flutter problems, but it actually had lower flutter specs than the 200. Then time marches on, they came out with the 350. They also came out with the short-lived 400, which was the pusher machine. It pushed the tape across the heads rather than pulling the tape. Actually, one of the things I could have shown, but we couldn't get the internet to happen, was I had a video of a 400 that I worked on, the 403. And when it worked actually pretty nicely, but it was a 2-motor machine. They decided to use 1 motor for the reels. So you had to always hit stop. You couldn't, sort of like what we call feather the tape, by hitting, if you were in rewind, you would hit fast forward to slow the tape down. On the 400, you had to hit the stop button to stop it. And sometimes the brakes didn't work right, and you had tape spilling all over the place. Well, Ampex was considered the first pro machine, and there was a lot of imitations, and then also there was a lot of small companies that wanted to jump on the tape bandwagon for home use. And you had the famous brush sound mirror machine,
sure,
which was a crossover. You saw a lot of pro people using it because it was cheap, and you saw a lot of people using it for a home machine. And
they made paper tape too.
And they made paper tape too. There was a lot of companies beginning to get involved in making tape. 3M wasn't the only one, but it was a lot of these small companies. 3M was the biggie. Another company that was down in Alabama, of all places, was Irish Recording Tape.
Sure.
Which was Orr, Bob, I think his name was Bob Orr. Was it Bob Orr, if anybody remembers?
David Orr? I can't remember.
He had a company called Orr Radio.
Yeah.
And he made tape machines also. He made a very interesting tape machine where the supply reel was right underneath the take-up reel. It was one reel on top, so the tape ran off the supply reel, went past the heads at a slight angle, and then wound right above it. This kept the machine small, so you could make a very small footprint.
Huh.
Yeah. But his Irish tape company got the interest of Ampex, and Ampex bought him out, and it became the Ampex Tape facility
Oh, wow.
in, I forgot the city at Alabama. It started with an
Opelika?
yeah, Opelika, thank
Yeah,
you, that's it.
Opelika, Alabama, yeah.
And that was the very first Ampex tapes. Some of the very first Ampex tapes was the Series 600 stuff, which was very reliable stuff. I mean, we can get into later the other problems with Ampex, but for now, Ampex became the second major competitor. Actually, the first competitor to 3M, because everybody, 3M was basically the tape
Right.
company.
Yeah.
But Ampex said, we're making tape machines, we want to have our own brand. Even though they said, yes, you can use 3M tape, we'd rather you'd use Ampex.
Of course.
Well, of course, 3M, saying, well, we'll start making our own tape machines. So they came out with the Minicom, was part of their Minicom division, and one of the things in that division was making tape machines. And one of their designs was the ISO-loop design, which was borrowed from the film sound recorders, believe it or not, that used sprocketed film, and later sprocketed film with a magnetic oxide on it. But the big plus about the ISO-loop drive was that if it was in the ISO-loop, it was impervious to the problems of the real motors. It was all contained, the tension was contained constantly between two caps, two pinch rollers and one capstan. So they borrowed the idea from the film machines and adapted it to magnetic tape, and that's what Dale had been working on. So they came out with their ISO-loop drives, and then one of the very first machines they came out with in the early 60s was the M23 machine. And that was the basis of their ISO-loop drive, and then they also came out with the Dynatrack system, which used 2 channels of electronics for each track. You had a high channel and a low channel.
Wow.
The high channel handled the high level signal of a tape, and the low channel handled the low signal of tape, and there was a switching system. This was an early form of getting around the problem of tape hiss.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So they used 2 electronics, one for high sensitivity, one for low sensitivity, and there was a switching system between it. So for stereo, you needed 4 channels and half-inch tape. There were pros and cons of the system, but it was a very early form of getting around noise reduction. The tape hiss problem.
So
It
but
also-
you don't see too many 3M machines these days.
No, it got a minor blip in there last year when the Queen Bohemian Rhapsody movie came out. They were using an M79 as a prop in the film, which they were using back in the 70s. They were using an M79.
Where did they find that one?
They're around. Yeah. They're still around. As a matter of fact, I do have one client down in New Jersey that's still using an M79. It does work. I mean, they required a lot of maintenance, but they to this day, they still sound, sometimes some people say they sound better than the Studer machines. The audio electronics were excellent in the 3M machines. When Media Sound got their first Studer A800, we were joking, saying, gee, we should take the audio electronics from the old 3M we have sitting in the corner and chuck the ones from the A800 and have the A800 transport, which was flawless at the time, and use the electronics from the 3M. We never went that far. It wasn't worth it. So, but
this is all fascinating. Let's talk about the present a little bit because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, I know.
So this was the time when, first of all, you could make money making music, and there was all this machinery in the industrial sense that was behind it. And here we are today. You have your own company.
Right.
Who are your biggest clients?
My biggest clients, besides the studios, are a lot of archive operations because they require the playback of all these tapes, and not just 2-track, but we're talking about 4-channel, 8-channel, 16-track, 24-track, 32-track, 40-track, 48-track. It's somehow split between the archive and studios because studios have rediscovered analog to some extent, and archive has always dealt with analog because they had to play back the stuff to put on digital formats and always had to go back to the analog tapes as digital kept improving.
Right. And one of the places you work very often is KCR.
One of the places that I regularly go to once a week, I take care of the facilities at WKCR FM, which is Columbia University Station 89.9 And they have a very unique situation where they play all formats on the air. You go into their studios, they have, besides the CD and people's laptops playing over the air, they have vinyl. They still have the 2 turntables. They got SL1200 Technics, still running there, fully maintained. We have 2 cassette decks, the Tascam 122 Mark IIs. We have Sony MDs, the mini disc.
Sure.
We have Panasonic DAT machines, the infamous SV3700s. We have, let's see what else we covered, the DATs, cassettes, and of course, reel-to-reel. We have 2 Otari MX5050 decks in master control, and in several in the production rooms and several in the A control room. And then we have a pretty extensive archive lab, Studio D, where we have all Studer machines, A80s and A20s. We also have 2 excellent turntables. We have a Adam York Preservation Archive Turntable 2, Simon York turntable, and we also have a Rockport turntable that came from Sony Music, which is the giant, the giant almost weighs 1,500 pounds, the thing with the 2 800-pound marble or granite bases with the separate,
And I hear Simon Yorks are not being made anymore.
No,
right?
Simon had to finally give it up. He just didn't have the time to make them anymore. So the Simon, we have this $26,000 Simon York, $26,000 Simon York turntable, and a $50,000 Rockport to
Not
play
bad.
back just about any vinyl that we have in the studio. We also have we have reference acetates, and we have 78s, and we have a couple of 16 RPMs sitting around. And
So what's the rationale for playing the original formats on the air? That seems...
KCR has a huge tape vault, probably about 10,000 reel-to-reel tapes, and some even off-site, of radio shows, interviews, concerts that were all done at KCR, which is programming that they can use today for their shows, because KCR basically still plays a lot of jazz, a lot of classical, and a lot of historic material as well. And what do they have sitting in their vault? All this old programming that they can play. Now, usually the air host would have to come in early or a couple of weeks early to sift through the tapes and figure out what's needed. Tapes had to be baked, because invariably some of them were done on Ampex. But you go into the vault, every brand of tape and every type of tape you could think of is sitting in that vault. Off-brand tape, which we affectionately known as white box tape, when if you saw a reel of Sam Goody tape, Sam Goody didn't make the tape, other people made that tape. So anyway, we used to call it white box tape because you didn't know where the hell it came from. A lot of times it was second runs of Ampex or 3M, and you didn't even know. Especially the infamous Shamrock tape was Ampex. Yep, good old Shamrock was. Oh, DAC. I don't even want to get into DAC, but Shamrock was Ampex's second and third generation rejects. And they got the name Shamrock because it was originally Irish tape, so why not call it Shamrock?
I didn't know that.
There you go.
Emerald, remember?
That was another Emerald, but I don't think that was a ripoff of Irish and Shamrock. So, as a matter of fact, there's a story that Seth wants me to say, that there's a place out in Long Island called Burlington Audio Video, and back in the 60s and 70s, Rudy Schwartz would get tape from either 3M, mostly from 3M, and we'd print the label on the box of what you want to call your own brand of tape. We had Corvette's tape, we had Macy's tape, we had Lafayette tape, but I don't know if it was Lafayette I think Lafayette got it from somebody else, but Concert tape was Radio Shack, and most of that was Ampex. Then we had what is it? There were several hi-fi stores in the city here that Grand Central Radio. They had their own brand of tape. Rudy made that tape for them.
And when you say made, you mean he boxed it? Or?
He boxed it. He slit the tape. He used to get wads. He used to get the reject wads from 3M and had tape slitting, and slit it down to 1/4-inch tape.
More or less. Yeah,
more or less. So you were lucky if it was on or off, depending on how often he changed the blades on the slit.
Yeah.
You got to remember, tape was manufactured in 3 to 4 foot wide webs, and then they would slit it down to the width that they needed, saying we're going to do a 1/4 inch run, or a 1/2 inch run, or a 1 inch, or a 3/4, or a 2 inch. So, slitting was a very precise thing. So tape manufacturing is a whole nother ball game. But
Yeah.
You mean he could be responsible for some of the Nixon White House tapes?
could be, could be. We never know, because Rudy also refurbished tape for the government.
Ooh. So, Bob, you brought up archives, and of course, this is an association that has a lot of archive members. And I want to hear your opinion on this whole, the thing that has been hammered over and over again, which is the future of these formats.
Okay.
And the whole thing about obsolescence, and how, as someone who is actually in the trenches, repairing these machines day in and day out, how do you see the future of these formats?
Well, this is the biggest problem that I have right now, is not the equipment, but finding people that I can mentor to learn this stuff. The equipment could stay around for years, but if people don't know how to use it, or even figure out what makes it work and how to repair it, it's harder and harder to find. I can't find kids that are interested in this stuff. You would think that somebody would take interest. Yes, there's a lot of young recording engineers, and kids that are using analog because they've discovered how great it sounds. But a lot of them just know how to use the equipment. They might be able to do a basic alignment, but they don't know anything about repairing, component level troubleshooting. And that's become another lost art, because today they teach electronics as saying, oh, you just swap boards out. It's IT, computer electronics. It's not real electronics. Just try and find a real electronic course these days. The most basic electronic course, you have to go to a technical school, which saying, well, if a kid's going to college, he's not going to go to a technical school. The closest thing to learning about electricity and electronics is if you're going to become an electrician. But electricians don't learn electronics. They learn what's good enough to work by as far as electricity. And yes, there is a fair amount of electronics involved. Yes, there's transformers, there's circuit breakers, there's insulation issues, there's plenty of things. Phase, different electrical phases, but as far as no tubes, no amplification. But they grasp the basic idea of electricity.
But yet, if there's a whole movement now, well, I guess it's never died out, but there's also a bit of I would say, a revival of boutique amplifiers or boutique.
Right, that is what they call the DIY crowd. The do-it-yourself crowd is like your
or
back
even,
room.
No, but even commercial ones.
Right, but they started out as backroom do-it-yourselfers, and then they go to the boutique, saying, well, let's make a real amplifier. Let's make a Class A or a Class AB, amplifier like the old hi-fi guys used to make.
Right.
And don't knock a lot of that old hi-fi gear. Some of it was excellent gear. Some of the Japanese gear from the 70s was incredible pieces of gear that you can still repair and still use. Probably by the mid-'80s, things started to go downhill there as far as the quality. Sure. I mean, the sound was there, but the way they were making it, they discovered more plastic and cheap and throwaway.
Sure.
But getting back to this thing of what we use today, we're still in a unique position that the old gear is still around. All right, most tape machines are now over 30 years old, with a few exceptions. There were Otari MX 5050s that were still being made as late as 2008. They were going for an outrageous price between $8,000 to $9,000 when they were originally like $1,200 machines.
Wow.
This is one of the major problems. If anybody wanted to make a machine today, it's just too expensive. There are a couple of companies in Europe that are making a machine. One in particular, if you've been following, is a company called Ballfinger.
Sure, I was going to ask you about that.
Right, their machines are like $22,000 for a basic stereo machine, but it has logic control, 3 motors, 3 heads, but not like a Studer machine. The latest quotes that people ask me, saying, well, if you had to make a Studer 820 today, luckily they're still around, and they're being refurbished, and they're going for insane prices. But somebody asked me, how much would an 820 from scratch cost? Well, if you got Studer to make it again, and believe it or not, the Studer engineers are hiding the molds for those in their garages, even though Harman doesn't want to tell them, that they can't make tape machines. One day they're going to make them again. But an 820 today would probably run between 50 to 100 grand to make a 2-track machine because of the machining involved and also updating the electronics of what's available today, because there are electronics in there that you can't get anymore. So they would have to upgrade. But to make a transport that stable would cost a fortune.
So you think the way to go is still to maintain the old
Yes.
the old decks? rather
We're
than
lucky
making-
enough that the engineers back then had the foresight to build their stuff so well, even though they didn't think that people would be still using them to this day. I mean, you got people still using old Ampex machines from 50, 60 years ago, and they're still working. They're a little rough on tape, but people are using them. Not so much for archival. I would not play archive material on those decks at all, but people are recording on them. Ampex 440s are a very popular machine, even the Scully 280s. The 3Ms are a little bit scarce, but they're around. There are MCIs by the dozen.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, there's a guy out in Nashville, Mirror Machines. Chris Mirror is rebuilding MCI tape machines and making them like they're brand new again. There's ATR Services in Pennsylvania that's big on bringing the Ampex 102 machines back into spec.
And the Technique series, the 1500, 1520s, that all the audio files are looking for.
Yes, yeah. The Technics, believe it or not, is a ripoff of the 3M Isoloop
That
drive.
makes sense, sure.
Yeah, it doesn't behave like the 3M. Actually, sometimes I'd say it's more reliable than the 3M. But the one thing about the Technics, great transport, but I believe the electronics can be way improved. And this brings to another thing, that if people are still using these tape machines today, if they really want to upgrade, especially for archival use, is to use modern electronics for the playback off the tape head. Still use the tape head that's in there, but make a direct takeoff of the head. And I do this. John French over at JRF, who's also very important person in this business. The guy's a savior as far as tapes and tape head design
Tape heads,
and tape path components and stuff. But he does the same thing too. Take a direct, bypass the electronics in the tape machine and go to an outboard tape preamplifier. Which is funny because back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of home hi-fi gear actually had a tape head
Sure.
input.
Yeah.
Because one way to save money was to buy a tape transport with just the tape head output. It's funny how things come around and go around.
The thing was Consulette Model 1s.
Right.
On certain models had what was called a tape head.
Right.
Equal-
Sony had a home machine called the Tape Player or something, where it was just a tape. It would play pre-recorded tapes only. You came out of the jack from the back of the machine into the tape head input of your amplifier, your preamp. A lot of people don't realize this, but the tape preamp in was equalized for 7.5 NAB, even though people were playing all different speeds through it. But it was a fixed 7.5 NAB, just like the phonograph preamp input was the RIAA curve.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you see the future? What do you think? I hear you when you say that it's hard to find someone who's willing to. I mean, there used to be the whole apprentice system. Of course, like we said earlier, the economics are not there anymore because there's far fewer machines out there working. And
I'm hoping that there are a couple of people out there that would want to take interest in it. I know that there are, because there's some that I follow on Facebook. I'm also the admin for the Reel-to-Reel enthusiast site, and that's Reel-to-Reel with the hyphens. There's a guy that ripped us off and just called us Reel-to-Reel without the hyphens, but I'm the one that's Reel-to-Reel with the hyphens enthusiast. And there's a lot of people on there, and it's a big mix. It's between the old pros to like the beginning hi-fi people that are getting into this. And there are people that are tinkering with this stuff. There's a couple of other guys that are servicing pro gear, thanks to, through the social media. You find out about these people, and other people recommend you, saying, where can I get this done? They say, oh, call Bob, blah, blah, blah. Or if we have a network across the country, there's a guy out in California, there's a guy up in Canada, there's a guy down in Nashville, there's a guy down in Florida. Because I can't possibly be everywhere at once, so.
Right. That's a great resource to know about.
But we're lucky enough that we still have the machines around, and they can be updated and modded. But what's going to happen 100 years from now or 200 years from now?
Or even 20. I mean,
Even 20.
Some of the documents that circulate about now, saying that, 10, 20 years, like, basically very few things will be playable.
Now, look
or
at
it'll be
film.
so expensive that...
Now look at film. There's still projectors that can play film. There's still telecines that can transfer your film to a video format. And this stuff is just as ancient as, if not even more ancient. It's whatever anybody has had managed to store in their back rooms. The film studios have saved a lot of this equipment. Record companies have saved some of this equipment. Engineers have saved their own personal machines. And the fact that the revival of analog sound in the recording studio has brought these machines out of the dark. The machine that was sitting in the closet saying, "What are we going to do with it?" I said, "Well, you silly, align it, and we can use it for our analog mixes now." So
yeah, I mean, I always say that one of the greatest things, or probably the best thing that it's ever happened to archives, is eBay. Like the fact that
Yes.
you can buy things now that
parts
used to be so
are
hard
available.
to get. Yeah,
What's funny is you even go on Amazon, you can find parts.
yeah.
Everybody's making these little stores, and you can get boutique parts and stuff.
So one thing that gives me encouragement now is that, one, it seems like young people are getting interested in actually good sounding sound again. And another one is also the maker movement, where people do like 3D printing and things like that.
Yes,
and create their own transports and things like that.
This is the future of getting some of these unobtainable parts, unobtainium. I actually sometimes have to make parts. I'll machine parts, like a piece breaks off a solenoid mechanism or a lever. I'll have to machine it, or somehow use stock parts and manage to machine it down from that.
Right.
But the next step is 3D imaging. There are people making NAB hubs in 3D imaging now.
Yep.
There are people making the Akai tape recorders with the old two-lever operation for the transport. There's cams in there that basically disintegrate because they were cheap pot metal. There's a guy that sat there and has a 3D printing, uses the plastic. It actually is more durable than the pot metal. And for $80, you get his whole kit of cams, and you can make your machine brand new again.
Yeah, it's funny because I think of, for example, how for a while we couldn't safely play cylinders, right? And now we can play them probably better than ever.
What do you call it? The
Archeophone.
Yeah, the Archeophone.
Yeah, and then Nick Berg's thing.
Right.
So I always feel like, the obsolescence thing is absolutely true, but that these are artifacts that we really care about, and that hopefully people are interested enough they can make the effort, to make them to make the machines run again, or even make better ones, like you said, better electronics, better parts.
I'm hoping that what will happen is that because young people are rediscovering the use of tape in their recording process, that they'll have these late night discussions about tape and design and tape machine design, and maybe a group will break off from there and start maintaining and maybe start building this stuff again. The other problem is, will the machinery outlive the tapes? Because, especially archival. What's going to happen to that? I mean, I know that in archiving, it's a never-ending battle. Somebody comes out with a new digital storage format and say, we got to do it all over again and go back to the original masters and transfer those to another format. When are we going to finally say we can leave it in this format and just take off from there?
Meaning as a WAV file? Or
WAV file. We keep improving our digital formats. Because I'll tell you, even though we have some great digital stuff today, I'll tell you, high-resolution digital sounds fantastic. Also, the direct stream audio. I was involved with the SACD, which was the direct stream format, the one-bit, 1-bit systems. I mean, back then they sounded incredible, but it was technology that was too early for people to appreciate. When we made this, unfortunately, at the same time, MP3s came out, and that put a whole kibosh on the whole SACD program. Here, Sony was going up, and everything went down at the same time. Right. Sony comes out with its first SACD player that was $7,000. That was enough to drive enough people away from it. And then even when they got it down to a $129 player, people didn't. But but record companies like Telarc embraced the technology and was recording their stuff on direct stream digital.
Yeah.
Now you have quadruple SACD formats with 11.3 megahertz sampling rates.
Yeah, I mean, I always say, and I may disagree with you on this, that there still has to be an oral test that proves that 4416 is distinguishable from all these high-end formats. But
The original CD format actually still holds up today, even though people criticize it, but
it sounds pretty
it
darn
sounds
good.
pretty damn good. Sounds better than MP3, that's for sure.
Yeah.
No, but really, today, even though it's over 30 years old, the gold standard is still that 44.1 sampling rate for
Yeah.
CD.
Those guys knew what they were doing, that's for sure.
Oh, Sony and Philips did quite a bit of research on it.
Yep.
The big problem was when they did the awful mastering of the early analog stuff to digital. That's where digital basically got a lot of its bad name, because it had such poorly mastered material. I mean, I know what was going on at Sony. They were hiring kids just to go straight off those 3/4 masters and saying, what are these notes in here? Oh, those are mastering notes. You don't need that for digital. Digital can handle everything. So there you go. This was a horrible.
Now I understand.
That's why, like, anybody that bought the first set of Stone CDs, the Rolling Stone CDs, they were horrible. First mastered Beatle stuff, horrible.
Yep.
They said, oh, you just have to run the tape and run it to the glass master. You don't have to do anything. No compression, no EQ, no fixing this up, blah, blah, blah. Oh, they played the wrong takes. A mess. Well, they had to quickly rectify that, and that's why Sony built a studio on 53rd Street with 14 rooms of mastering to straighten out a lot of that mess. But the bean counters killed that, but luckily, Sony got smart again. They have a small facility there on West 44th Street where they can still do the legacy material, and they're doing a very good job mastering that stuff now.
That's great. We probably should be wrapping it up pretty
Yeah.
soon. Any questions from the audience? And thank you, Bob.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, we could have gotten into
we got half an
stuff.
hour here. Let's look.
Ever worked on a Stevens?
Yes. Up until, actually, I worked on one about 2 years ago. There's a studio out in Queens, and they just got rid of them. Because even though the Stevens is a great machine, talk about a machine that needs maintenance.
Yeah.
And there's very little documentation. The main guy behind that machine that's still around is David Keane up in Canada. But he doesn't even want to get involved with it anymore. Stevens is long gone. The whole idea of Stevens was that he took the original 3M transport and built his own electronics around it and made it the first portable 24-track. He's also known as,
40-track.
he could put it in, he got it into 2 road cases. You could carry it around for remote recording. He also created the incredible 2-inch 40-track machine. And there's a guy out in Brooklyn that has the 40-track transport, but not the electronics for it. He only has it up to 24. So
That seems like the worst of both
yeah.
worlds.
Oh, the track width was worse than cassette. So,
Yeah.
but the Stevens machines, what happened was 3M wouldn't sell him machines anymore because it was sort of like competition, taking the 3M transport and selling it under the Stevens name. So Stevens made the transport even better. He came out with a complete system that didn't use pinch rollers. Yeah, it was just a capstan and a reversing idler. And everything was controlled by the reel motors, a la the Ampex ATR 102, but the Stevens didn't even have a capstan motor. Everything was just the 2 motors done by the reel motors. Everything was servoed, and it worked, and it was a very simple circuit too.
It was like the Tesla of
Yeah,
of tape decks.
definitely the Tesla of tape decks, and it made the machine lighter.
Makes sense.
So, I mean, my first Stevens I saw back in the 70s when Stevens was still making them, and I used to see Stevens at the booth at AES. I even still have a little screwdriver that says Unusual Systems Stevens Industries or whatever, Steven Tape Designs. Well, here we are around 2016, 2017, a studio in Brooklyn called Figure 8. Got 2 of them, one for parts and one to make to work, and we got one to work, but you had to constantly tinker with the servo. It kept drifting all the time. Yeah, even though we replaced all the bad parts and everything, it's just that it was old. The machine was over 40 years old.
Like some of the early Ampexes.
Yep. But the early Ampexes were based on a solid design. You know, the regular capstan and pinch roller designs. But they had problems. But I mean, a 440 or a 102 still holds up today. Of course, for real heavy duty use, you would go with the Studer either the A80 series or the 820, even the 810s, and even B67s. All those Studer machines were just a refinement of what we had, though Willie Studer will claim that he wanted to make a machine just as good as Ampex, because he always looked up at Ampex, particularly like the old MR70, which is that real unusual Ampex machine that came out in the early 60s. It was like twice the price of any studio deck at the time. You'd have to look it up. The MR70 used, instead of tubes, it was using new Vistors, which was the next step to transistors. The big downfall of Ampex was that it took them so long to come out with a transistorized machine. That's why the Scully 280 won out for a couple of years, because it took Ampex forever to come out with the AG350, their first solid-state machine, which was a disaster. The 440 was the machine that corrected all the problems. But Willie Studer was looking at the old MR70, said, I want to make a machine as good as the MR70. Well, he definitely did that and surpassed it. So the A80 was an incredible tape machine, and the 820 is basically the pinnacle of tape precision. However, I will say that in future years, the A80 ARSC will outlast the 820, because the 820 is so microprocessor based. It's basically running a 35-year-old, computer. Yeah. But and unfortunately, it uses software programs and EEPROMs that can suddenly disintegrate, and you got to make sure you have a copy of them. One of my fellow servicemen, who's even older than me, Dan Zellman, actually burns the chips for you, or there's a website called Analog Rules, a company called Analog Rules, that will take your chips and make copies of them. I would do it if I had an EEPROM burner. What's funny is, well, Bob, how come you got all this gear and you don't have an EEPROM burner? I said, well, every studio I worked in had an EEPROM burner. EEPROM burner is what burns the set of instructions into these EEPROMs, which is an erasable programmable ROM, which carries the instructions to operate the microprocessor. I said, I always had one at my disposal at a studio, but I never bought one. Well, today you can get one of these days I'll get one that interfaces with your computer, and I'll be able to burn ROMs. But there's other problems. Motors go bad. Luckily, there's motor rebuilding services around. There's still a network of people that can build this stuff to get motors rebuilt. John French that I mentioned, JRF Magnetics, will relap heads and will also supply even new heads. The guy could build you a head if you had to.
But he also has no exit strategy, shall
Well,
we say.
it's funny. 15 years ago, he wanted to retire. He said, nobody's going analog anymore. Well, guess what? He had to come out of retire because everybody was coming back to him.
Yeah.
Plus the fact John French is one of the few people that can play back some of these black boxes from planes. He's fully knowledgeable on because he's basically the mentor of everything that's tape magnetics and tape heads.
There was a guy down in D.C., Mike McDermott is the other expert.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you got all of my buddies down there at the Library of Congress, which are always fooling around with a lot of stuff. But John French gets involved with these old instrumentation recorders, from NASA to play back the old stuff. And also there's a guy out in Michigan that rebuilds pinch rollers, Terry Witt rubber rollers.
That's where John got some of his.
Right, John gets his stuff. Terry rubber rollers rebuilds idler wheels, pinch rollers to anything. He rebuilt the rubber rollers for the NASA instrumentation machines. And don't say, who is this guy? Well, he's a retired GM engineer in the rubber division. The guy knows more about rubber than you'd ever want to know. He knows everything about durometer settings and different types of rubber and stuff. And he said, as long as it has a metal hub, he can put a tire on it. So they will even rebuild cassette pinch rollers.
Speaking of cassettes, remember those two 122 Mark IIIs I brought?
Yes.
Tell them the story, what you had to do on that.
Okay, the 122s are a favorite machine for archivists because there's several little tricks you can use for them. You can change the azimuth playback head screw from the crummy Phillips head that you're really only supposed to touch maybe once in a blue moon.
Well, you know what they did in there? They would align it, and then slap a piece of paint on, saying that's where it's supposed to
Yeah, they took a piece of Loctite and that was it.
Yeah,
Who's the manufacturer?
Tascam.
Well, Tascam, because it was a factory setting.
Yeah, I remember.
But as you know, cassettes come from all kinds of, you get a stack of cassettes that are from everything, and azimuth was a very poorly kept maintenance thing on a cassette deck. So invariably, if you're an archivist, you would summon to mono and watch the phase or watch it on a scope. Most of the time you had to do it by ear. Well, that Phillips head screw wasn't designed to be hit 100 times in a month. Well, I didn't originate it, but it came from some librarian in the Midwest.
I'll tell you where it came from.
Yeah,
Could I have the mic so this way we get this on here?
yeah.
I was at an Ars Technical luncheon, and Conrad Strauss from Indiana University just happened to pass something as we were sitting there about that on their task cams. They put this Allen screw
They
in.
use a 2 millimeter by 6 millimeter Allen cap
Right.
head screw.
Head screw in there. Because
Stainless steel,
Because where I worked part-time at the New York Public Library in the...
yeah, which I modified those, yeah.
That was because of me.
Yeah.
I called up Danny Spardello, who was my
Right.
boss. I got him on the cell phone when I walked outside. I said, Danny, we found the problem to our azimuth problem.
Yep.
And how many machines have you redone that on so
Oh,
far?
my God, dozens of machines.
Including
I did-
mine.
You
yeah.
just did 4.
I
No,
did
six.
six of them for WNYC,
Yeah.
New York Public
Yeah,
Radio.
because that original azimuth screw was made like out of peanut butter. It was never meant to...
Well, like I said, it
yeah.
was only made to be touched once in its lifetime, maybe 2 times.
Right.
It wasn't made to be touched constantly.
And you have to check the azimuth when you go to side 2 on a cassette, too, many a times.
So, what could be
Yeah.
more reliable than an actual Allen head screw?
Right, but tell them what you had to do to mine, and I said keep the schemes on.
Well, the
Remember
other
what
problem
happened?
is that
Yeah.
you had a Mark III, right?
2 Mark IIIs that
Yeah.
exhibited the same problem. I bought them at the same
Okay,
time.
they used a very elaborate servo capstan motor, direct drive,
Mm-hmm.
where the actual rotor of the motor is part of the circuit board of the motor itself. And the circuitry, the servo motor circuitry, is part of the motor too. All surface mount, miniaturized components. They use these little capacitors that are probably about the size of a, probably about the size of this pen top. Ultra miniature, and the big problem was, again, these machines are almost like 30 years old, maybe
Yeah.
20, 25 years old.
Yeah.
A lot of these miniaturized capacitors dry out, especially the electrolytics. Not like the big ones which go bad a lot later, but these little tiny ones, there's hardly anything in them. They were drying out, and the weirdest thing would happen is all of a sudden the motor, instead of running at 1 7/8, suddenly goes at 300 IPS. It starts whirring away, or they go in the other direction, they don't even turn.
Yeah, mine was going at about half the speed with incredible
they-
wow.
they-
Both machines exhibited the
Yeah,
same
they can
problem.
go either way. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the problem is, even in the service manual from Tascam, there's no drawing of this servo card. They just say, there it is, servo motor. You bought it as a whole unit. Well, that'd be great if Tascam was still selling it. TIAC doesn't sell it anymore. They kept whatever they had in stock and sold it, and then they ran out of them. The Mark II, by the way, used a conventional DC motor, so you didn't have to worry about this problem. But the Mark III was the final refinement of the 122 series.
Lovely.
Well, you had to do some reverse engineering of the design of that card, and I found out that these surface mount caps were just dropping in value. Luckily, the values are actually still printed on these little tiny caps, so you're able to determine the value and the working voltage of these caps, and there was a little band on it to tell you which was the negative side and the positive side. Now, there were 2 other caps in there that didn't have the negative positive. They were bipolar caps. You can still find them, but what I did was, because the value was there, I put standard miniature caps in there that that would go on a regular through-hole type circuit board, and get in there very carefully, unsolder the surface mount. You got to have a nice gentle iron with it, and install these caps on it, and they would be sticking out and all different. If Seth ever opened it up, he said, "Oh my God, look at these things sticking out. These oversized."
I'm not opening it up.
Yeah.
I'm leaving it alone.
These oversized
It
caps
works.
coming
Don't
out of this
fix
little
it.
tiny circuit board, and the
fine.
speed is running fine now.
It's working. It's
Yeah.
been working perfectly.
And, the cap will probably run good for another 20, 25 years. But
Okay.
probably
At
something
that
else
point,
will-
do you think I'm going to worry?
Nah.
You think I'll be around to worry? Maybe. Who knows? If I'll
So-
even know who I am.
So that's the thing, is there's sometimes you got to do little modifications on these machines.
Yeah.
And now cassettes are considered archival playback material because everybody recorded everything on cassettes.
Oh, yeah.
So it's now another thing you got to add to the list of reel-to-reels and micro cassettes and people
Right.
using dictation machines to record on. Please.
Oh, the micro cassettes. Yeah.
And then of course,
Yeah.
have you guys gone into the IBM magnetic belt
No,
for the
No.
dictation machines? People were recording stuff on those things.
I'm not aware of that.
And then there was
Wasn't there something that looked like an 8-track? Someone sent me a picture of it that had rubber grommets inside that was
Well, they
used
were
for
broadcast carts.
No, not this.
Yeah.
Looked more like an 8-track filled with tape, and it had 2 rubber grommets to pull it through. And of course, the grommets had completely deteriorated. It went into some sort of specific Scotch 3M machine. It was
Well,
a 3M cartridge.
There was a 3M Instacart that was their broadcast cart.
How much time could they hold on those tapes?
Well, the standard cart could only hold a couple of minutes, but there was larger
No.
size broadcast carts, the size AA and A size.
That's- yeah.
that could hold up to an hour of programming.
Those are the ones.
Yeah, these were the larger size broadcast carts. They weren't used very often because most radio stations use the little carts for commercials, IDs, and jingle spots, and sometimes they even record the top 40 hits on them.
And then the other fun one too is 8-track. Believe it or not,
Well, we had 8-track home recorders.
8-track home recorders, and some of them were used to do interviews on. I've seen that.
I know, I
wow.
got people that
Yeah.
record their band demos on those things. So you had to keep an 8-track cartridge machine around in your house.
Oh, that wonderful thing! Every
Then we had
23 minutes,
4-track
clunking.
cartridges.
Right.
And then the very first endless loop cartridge, the casino cart, that was the original form of the endless loop from the 50s. These were used for these demos where you needed a little talk to keep repeating itself. And that's what Fidelipac took and redesigned as the Fidelipac cartridge, which later became the broadcast NAB cart.
Lovely.
And then, of course, there was a zillion companies that made, Gates made them, Spotmaster, ITC, made all these cart machines.
I may want to add something in. When I saw Jack Mullen back in 1994 out at AES, he told me a great story about when they had the first Ampex 200 and they brought it over to NBC in the spring of '48 to demonstrate, how tape worked. And he said, we set this whole thing up. We got all the engineers sitting there, and we start recording something coming off the airwaves, coming in off the network, and we're flipping from source to tape, and they just can't believe the clarity.
Yeah.
So they said, okay, we're going to bring the executives and the accountants in who are going to write the check, get the machine ready. So he said, so we wound the tape back. The guys come in, they hit the play button, and all they hear is whoop, 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 whoop. And Jack went, oh, God. We forgot to ground the capstan motor. And what happened is when they wound the tape back, the capstan motor was magnetized. It completely had wiped the tape going back. And he said, we quickly ran a ground inside the machine and then recorded and did a playback for him. And they said, all right, how much? And they had it there as early as spring of '48. And I do know something. You remember with the flanges?
Yeah.
They had recorded the Beethoven Ninth telecast with Toscanini on April 4th. And someone was there, witnessed it, that when they finished it, the guy didn't have the bottom flange in properly. So when he picked the whole thing up, the tape went like a bird's nest down onto the machine. And they used to make a joke when it flew up, it looked like a big bird's nest flying around.
Well, the demonstration that Ampex did with its first video recorder went a lot more successful.
That was in '56,
Yeah, that was in
wasn't it?
'56.
Yeah.
It was an NAB show, and they finally got it to work, the VR1000. And I forgot who it was that made a speech. I think it was one of the network people made a speech, and they were talking about that. There's another great NAB show. Blah blah blah. Thank you for attending. And he was talking about a bunch of stuff, and he said, now the Ampex Tape people have something to show us at this meeting. And he walked away, curtain opens up, and there's a TV monitor, and you see the guy talking on it. But the guy talking is just standing there smiling. And people saying, what is it? And it's not a kinescope, being played on a TV. It looks just like the guy's just standing there recording. It was what he just recorded. Curtain opens up from behind. Here's this giant machine with racks of gear, and it was the VR1000. And there was like 40 or 50 people in the room, and they just got up and gave an applause for a solid 10 minutes. And the video recorder was born.
Wow.
Because that's a whole other story in itself about what television was going through back then.
Absolutely.
The short story was that television was using more film than Hollywood per month to record TV shows, and it was just too expensive. They had to find something, and they turned to companies to come out with the video recorder. Bing Crosby had his own company. RCA was trying, but they were all using modified tape audio tape machines running at ridiculously high speeds, and the picture couldn't be stable enough. And it was Ampex, a group of Ampex guys that came up with the whole idea. One of them, people on there, was a teenager named Ray Dolby.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. There was Alan, there was Ginsberg. I forgot all the names, but there was a machinist that came up with how to design the rotating heads. But it was one of the guys that came up with the idea of rotate the heads at a high speed to get the writing speed.
Brilliant.
And because of that, and they came up with a quad, what they call the quad format with 4 heads, running vertically across the tape. And the heads would run at about 15,000 RPM, and it would give a writing speed of approximately 1,000 IPS, which could record the 5 megahertz video signal that was needed, or 6 megahertz signal needed to record a complete TV signal.
Yeah, amazing.
Now, we're talking about a machine from '56 that cost $50,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, Gary,
Hold on, Gary. You're first, and then pass it over to Phil. We got about, I don't know, 10 minutes.
Yeah, 'cause I think they-
You didn't mention audio tape, which I always thought was better than 3M. And eventually they were bought by Capitol.
Which brand, sorry?
Audio tape.
Yeah, audio tape, which was up in Connecticut. I think that's where they were from.
No, they were in Jersey, I think.
Jersey?
They had a New York address on the boxes.
Is the same company as
Could be.
Yeah, same people that made audio disc. It was audio tape. Yeah. But audio tape, was bought by Capitol, and
Yeah.
it became Capitol Tape. The thing was that the audio tape company never went beyond their regular shiny back tape. They never got involved with the
Carbon black.
with the carbon black, the back coated
They
tapes.
never lasted that long. I will tell you one thing, though, if I could have that for a second. Tom Fine said that his father, Bob Fine, when they were doing the
Yeah,
mercury material, they went to audio tape. They didn't like Scotch, they didn't like Ampex. They said the shape of the noise floor was a lot cleaner using audio tape than anything else.
Well, it was common knowledge that Ampex had more modulation noise than anybody else's tape. 3M went through several different generations of tape, and
201.
yeah, the original 201. But I'll tell you, they're one of their most successful tapes, and to this day holds up better than any back-coated tape ever made. Was the Scotch 206, which was their first back-coated tape. That tape never shed. It works. But it
Right.
wasn't a high output tape, but damn,
Right.
you could make a lot of great recordings with that tape.
Yeah, I think Dennis told me over at Minnesota Public Radio, that's what they used to run all the reference
It was
tapes.
one of the most reliable tapes
Yeah.
ever made was 206.
And it never got to the sticky shed
Never had sticky shed problem.
problems, yeah.
I mean, when I was a kid, one of the first high-end tapes that I used was Scotch 206, 207, 207 being the 1 mil.
Yeah.
When I got into working in the studio, I started using Scotch 250, which sometimes was great and sometimes failed. They went through a lot of batch problems.
Yeah, major dropout problems.
Right,
on
but
those.
when
Yeah.
250 worked, it was probably the most incredible tape ever made. Also, it required more bias than any other tape to this day to work, and a lot of machines could not bias properly with it or even erase properly. A lot of old Ampex 440s couldn't erase them, and Scully 280s couldn't erase them. You had to
Really?
do some modifications. I used to do modifications on the Scullys to make them work, but Ampex had problem. Even the Ampex 440 had problem erasing 456. It could erase 406, but it couldn't erase 456.
Really?
Yeah. Of course, the 440C could erase anything. But the battle was that 250 was around, and then they came out with 996, which I think was 3M's finest tape. But 3M got out of the tape business because it wasn't a number one product, and 3M was a very strange company that if it wasn't a top product in their top 10, they'd get out of it. And
Right.
that's when they dissolved the 3M tape division and the 3M tape machine division, and also the 3M digital tape machine, which came
yeah.
out in the early 80s.
The Dash.
The early Dash format. 3M got out of it because they asked Sony a simple question. We're making these machines. They cost a lot of money. Nobody's buying them. How come you guys are involved making this tape and tape machines and giving them away at a ridiculous price? Well, Sony said, well, we're not in it to make the machines. We're in it to what's being made on those machines, meaning the music end product. When 3M heard that, They said, that's it, we're getting out of digital tape and the whole thing altogether, which I'm paraphrasing from Jack Mullen. There was a fantastic AES series about the American pro tape machine industry. It was put out on 6 VHS tapes. I don't know if it ever got converted to DVD, and each tape was about Ampex or 3M or Scully or MCI, which was Jeep Harned's place. Even one tape on the ADAT, the guy that was from Elise's talked about his father. It was an American tape machine company too. So, but that's the classic story about that 3M came from the 3M story, why 3M got out of digital tape. They said, well, we're never going to make money on this thing, so we're out of it. So not only did they close shop on digital, they closed shop on analog and got out of business.
So I have a quick question about tapes that's always nagged me. You know how Kodak film, they made it on purpose pink so that it looked better. Did tape formulations ever, were they ever aimed at not giving you a flat response, but giving you more highs, more lows, having a characteristic sound?
I found that more in consumer tapes than pro stuff. Pro stuff was pretty straight ahead. You had to be. If it didn't work on your machine, you threw it out and you didn't make a sale. But consumer machines were made for a wide range of tapes because nobody's going to sit and rebias a consumer machine for every roll of tape you put on there.
XL2S, remember that?
Yep. Well, if people remember the EE tapes that were for consumer, the extra efficiency tapes.
Wasn't that for European use?
No, there was also for US, but it was very short-lived.
Yeah,
It was to compete with the metal tapes for cassette. Another wonder. Metal tape was a great idea, but it wore down the heads. So there you go.
You got one other question? Let's get
Sure.
Phil and then.
I hope Mike is paying attention to all of this, since CCNY is going to inherit my collection and the equipment at some point when I die. No collector ever expects to die. But that'll also include a couple of tape sonics.
Yeah, the Tape Sonic machines. That was the guy
I
here
have
in Manhattan that
two.
built them. I forgot
At
his
least
name.
2. I may have 3.
Yeah,
He was in where the building next to where the Tower Annex was.
yeah.
On Lafayette.
Oh, yeah.
Broadway.
Yeah.
Yeah, you went to him and saying, I want your machine. You give him a down payment, he'd build you a machine, and you got a machine a couple of weeks later, and he told you what you do.
He didn't want a down payment.
It was a poor man's Ampex.
Yeah.
Sam Miller.
That's it.
The guy who told me about the machine,
Gary, talk into the mic so we can hear you.
the guy who told me about the machine, who was in the Army with me, also wanted to get one. And Miller didn't like him and wouldn't sell him one.
Love it.
Yeah,
But
he was. Yeah,
I had
he was
the,
picky.
still have the 70A stereo, which is like the Ampex, only heavier and with only one handle. And I've got the 2 chassis one, and I may have another one. I haven't been to the locker in the basement in years.
My experience with the Tape Sonic was that the wiring and the electronics were top class. The transport was a little bit on the primitive side. It worked, but it was a little
Yeah.
bit primitive because he didn't have the machining capabilities of like a large manufacturing.
And he told me not to use the 3 3/4 speed.
Because it was just a compromise.
It was a 3-speed machine.
Sure. But it was there just in case somebody gave you a 3 3/4 tape, you could play it.
Yeah.
It's the same thing like Studer 820 has 3 3/4, but my God, it's not what I call presentable.
Huh.
Gary, if you give it to Phil, and then we're going to.
Yeah.
It's good to see you again, Bob. I don't know if you remember coming over to my place about a year and a half ago and working on an RCA 21D.
Right.
Have you come across any others?
No, yours was the only one. Other than before that, there was a couple that I've run into, but I got a good lesson on that machine.
Well, it's still working very well, and thank you.
Yep.
You're truly an encyclopedia with regard to history and electronics, and certainly a very valued person in my life to be able to go to with regard to upkeep, because there aren't too many more people like you. And it's almost disappointing to see how few came out today just to be here.
Yeah.
What you stated is so true. I mean, you have trouble finding young people to pick up the baton, and I think that is a key factor, because without the enthusiasm and the ability to carry on that torch, even if you have the equipment or the materials, it becomes a museum piece. I have another museum piece, and Seth is fully aware of it because he had a little input on it. And I'm waiting 8 years for the Library of Congress to be able to go forward with what was an initial proposal with Matt, and that is autograph. Have you ever come across autograph discs or a machine?
Yes, as a matter of fact, at the Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library, public library, they have an autograph machine that they want me to refurb. I grabbed the belts off of that thing, and I found belts for it.
Good.
And what we're going to basically do with that machine is come straight off the pickup into a preamp and listen, because it's not worth fixing the electronics. We just want to get the disk drive to work.
So I have a refurbished autograph machine, which is in great working condition. I was very fortunate to be able to
We
get
might want to
this.
use yours.
You might want to, because I do
If I
have
can get
one.
this thing to work.
However, I have 130 autograph discs. That was a great gold mine find
Yeah.
about 7 years ago. And what was really amazing was that, and I've never been able to track down who, what, when, where, why, but you have 130 autograph discs, two sides, one complete week of KNXT, CBS, TV broadcasting from 6 a.m. to sign-off, from September 1st through September 7th, 1957. It's incredible. And while the quality is not perfect, right, Seth?
Yeah, but there's definitely
You have content.
fairly well, if it's played back right, you can
Correct.
tell that it's off the line. It's not off a television. Even if
No, it was direct line. And I'm so curious to this day.
Oh.
I mean, could you imagine someone commissioning this? We want to have 1 week of CBS TV out in California, KNXT.
Could it be a lawsuit? Could it be
Excuse me?
A lawsuit? Sometimes that's what.
For a whole
triggers
week?
those things.
I've never heard of it before, during, or since. I mean, we're familiar with 1 week of radio, but not TV.
it may have been something for advertisers. Maybe they wanted to see how the flow of everything was going,
Well-
how fast they got the
But for a week, that's what's a killer. Anyway,
Let me talk about that for a second there. My dad was in advertising. He worked for a lot of the big ad agencies here in the city, and there was a lot of services that did what they call commercial monitoring. They were independent companies that would have special cameras that would film the spot or photograph spots off the TV, and it would go back to the agency or the traffic people saying that this commercial did run. One of the things that my dad had, and I gave to the Museum of Broadcasting, now the Paley Museum, was we had a kinescope from the Tonight Show of when Johnny Carson was on in 1962, I think. And it was a segment with Jackie Mason, of all people, but it had the commercials on that whole kinescope, because there were several sponsors that were on there, and they needed a copy of the show. Most of the time, they would only record just like the minute before or the minute after, before the commercial, just to know that you would get a reference, a time frame saying, here, it actually showed on the Today Show. Well, here we had, 6 reels of 16 millimeter film of an entire Tonight Show.
well, that's super rare,
Yeah, that
especially
is
for
super rare.
1962.
Yeah.
And as we know, so much of Carson is lost through
Yeah.
the 60s.
Right, they kept using
And if
tape.
anything, that would have been dumped afterwards, confirmed, not confirmed,
What a lot of
and
people
thrown out.
what a lot of people didn't realize that even though we had videotape, they were still making kinescopes.
Oh yeah, through
delayed broadcast.
I have examples in my archive.
Yeah.
It's audio, obviously,
you got
archival
a lot of
television audio. through 1974, where kinescopes were still being used at NBC,
Right.
which was late in the game. And then you see almost overnight a complete flip
Sure.
to
See,
3/4 inch, and they
30 Rock was still using 2-inch quad in the mid-'80s.
What?
Yeah, as backup protection.
NBC Radio was still cutting 16-inch discs in the 70s.
Sure. Yeah. You'd be amazed that,
And it was mostly due, I found, to the unions. These were the older guys, and this is
Yeah.
what they were paid to do, and they had to keep doing it.
they used it a lot for protection.
I shot the second front line. It was 88 seconds in Greensboro. It aired in January of 1983. It was one of the few initial shows that actually was on quad. And then they went for a year on 1-inch, and then that was the end of that. So quad lasted, a
Oh, yeah,
little
they were
bit.
still around. Look, WPIX 1981 was still using 2-inch for their backup protection copy on air, even though they had the 1-inch machines.
Just an anecdote, and I'm going to let the microphone go. It was about 10 years ago, I got a call. They were dumping everything at WPIX in Astoria, in their warehouse. And I was invited to come down. This woman said, you want to take a look at what's there? There was John Tillman, 1949 films, 16 millimeter when he was doing the news. And they were going to be dumping all of this stuff. I took a few things, but it was horrible. I mean, that without really discerning exactly what was what, I'm looking at a warehouse of stuff. And this was late in the game. This was, about 10 years ago. And for a souvenir, I took a couple of 2-inch quads, just to have. Can you imagine? $500, 26 pounds, 1 hour is crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful, evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bob. And
This also means that there's going to be a part 2, whether you like it or not, gentlemen. We're going to have to continue this.
All right, guys.
well, but first you need to fix the Tandberg, though.
Fix your Tandberg.
Fix my Tandberg cassette deck.
I got a wire recorder I got to talk to you about. Anyway,
And thank you all for
gentlemen,
coming.
thank you very much. Just
welcome.
want to let you know, next meeting is April 18th, 2019. It's going to be my friend Gary Galo, who's going to do RIA equalization for velocity-sensitive and displacement-sensitive phono cartridges. If you don't know what that's about, he'll explain it to you next month. All have a good night. Stay dry. Let's hope the spring is going to turn into a spring. Thanks again. And thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
And Marcos, thank you.